This week, we return to the 9th chapter of Mark, as Jesus and the disciples are walking through Galilee, and Jesus tells the disciples for the second time that the Son of God must undergo suffering and die and be raised again on the third day. And we are told that the disciples, yet again, don't understand, but Mark tells us they're afraid to ask Jesus about it. But why would the disciples of our great teacher be afraid to ask him a question? Well, up to this point, we have heard time and again about how the disciples misunderstand Jesus, and we've heard Jesus's, let's call it, bewilderment at their lack of understanding. He said things like, "Do you not yet perceive or understand? Do you have eyes and yet not see? Do you have ears and yet still do not hear?" Even in the verses leading up to this week's story, we hear Jesus chastise the disciples for their lack of faith and their lack of prayer. So I can see why the disciples might be afraid to ask Jesus a question. They don't want to admit, yet again, that they just don't get it. But what is blocking the disciples' understanding? What is hardening their hearts? Could it be that what Jesus is talking about is a world order that is simply unlike anything they have ever experienced? I mean, they're expecting the Son of God, the Messiah, to usher in and overthrow their enemies and bring in a time of glory, not to die on a cross. And we know that the disciples are caught up in the ways of the world as they are caught arguing about which of them is the greatest. And of course they're arguing about these things. They are the disciples of the Son of God, the great Messiah. They're expecting any day that as Jesus assumes his place of glory, that they, as the disciples of the great Messiah, will come into their social superiority. I can believe that the disciples are blinded by self-ambition and by a desire for greatness. But Jesus never stops teaching them. And he sits down among them and calls the 12 to him, and he tells them that greatness is found in servanthood. And then he takes a child into his arms, and he tells them that discipleship is about welcoming these, the lowest of society, the least valued, the most forgotten. Can't you imagine the disciples' confusion? Wait, you mean the kingdom of God isn't about a crown of gold and about positions of grandeur? It's about humility and servanthood and death? But what does that mean about my life? See, when I think about the disciples' lack of understanding, about how they fumble again and again as they try to follow Jesus, about how they are caught up in the ways of the world, I can't help but ask myself, am I any different? Does my life show that I believe in the kingdom of God in this upside-down world? Or am I too afraid to ask? Am I too afraid to change? I look forward to seeing you in worship.